Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. It looks like it's going to be a great afternoon here. My name is Steve Spellman. I have the great privilege to be president of the council, which essentially means I work for SID, and it's something that I enjoy, and so very happy to be here. I want to thank you all again for coming, and I want to thank our sponsors, specifically first M&T Bank, which is represented by Jamie Kelly, who is a senior VP at the bank. And through Ms. Kelly's efforts, the bank has made a very generous $5,000 contribution so that we can sponsor events just like this one. So thank you, Jamie. I'd also like to thank Wilbraham and Munson Academy and Sir Speedy, which contribute to this. I want to thank three people who are here: Jeremy Cole, Jeff Krasner, and Chris Cronin, who are responsible for this being taped. You'll be able to see it on our website in a few days and also on YouTube. We currently don't have any programming scheduled. We will let you know when we have new programming. If you are not a member, we have membership forms at the table where Sid is sitting. And also, I'd love to have you sign up for that, because it's just a wonderful thing. You can join at any amount you want and support lectures like this with this organization. Along those lines, I'd like to thank the wonderful Colleen Moynihan, who is here again, who helped bring the lunches over and get everybody registered. Lastly, our speaker today, Professor Pleshakov, will be introduced by Jamie, and she again is the Senior Vice President for Commercial Lending at M&T Bank. She has been personally a tireless supporter of our council, and we owe her a lot. We owe her for the wonderful scholarship for these events, but just to let you know what else she does and what a contributor she is to the community, she's active in leadership roles in the Western Massachusetts Economic Development Council, the Make-A-Wish Foundation, the Munson Memorial Half Marathon and 5K, and the Munson Home for the Aged. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Jamie Kelly. You can. I'm not opposed.
Okay. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is. Nice to see everyone. I wanted to start off by thanking Steve and Sid and Colleen, but I have to go back to Sid for 1 second, because I've known Sid for, it's over 20 years now. And I know you keep thanking me for my tireless support. We need to thank Sid for her unbelievable efforts. I think I started with a small bank called the Bank of Western Massachusetts in 1997. That's how long I've known about the World Affairs Council in Western Mass. So, it's because of her. So with that said, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Professor Pleshakov, who has published 6 books on geopolitics, war, and revolution, translated into 12 languages. His most recent book is The Crimean Nexus: Putin's War and the Clash of Civilizations. He has taught courses in critical social thought, history, international relations, political science, and Russian and Eurasian studies. In 2012, the Princeton Review included him in the Best 300 Professors anthology. Before emigrating to the United States, Pleshakov worked for a foreign policy think tank in Moscow. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. It's a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I remember I spoke to you on Zoom about 2 years ago, slightly less than that. We were at that point just at the beginning of this disaster, the war in Ukraine. And I'm very sorry, I could not start by saying, okay, folks, I have some breaking news. Putin is dead, right? So Ukraine is free. Unfortunately, that's not what I plan to share with you today. Almost 2 years into that war, and as we all know, Now, more and more questions are being asked. So, how is this going to end? Is this going to end? What's Putin's end game? Isn't it time for some kind of peace talks, compromise, settlement? Let's talk about that. I would like to start by going through our hopes of the spring of 2022. Clearly, the response of the Western community, led by the United States, was very strong, unified, and NATO, for example, started functioning as an alliance again under the leadership of the United States. Yes, the Western community started working together. So what were our hopes? So what could we do for Ukraine? What could happen to Russia? First, possibly military affairs, right? When the war started on February 24th, 2022, most experts were quite pessimistic about the future of Ukraine and the possible success of the Ukrainian armed forces. There were expectations, not unreasonable, that Russian troops would march into Kiev in 3, 5, 7 days. Foreign embassies were evacuated. US diplomats even spent their nights in Poland, just in case, well, completely understandable and wise. So, but Kiev did not fall. The Ukrainian military were able to stop the enemy there, and then, started pushing them back to the border, and actually by the fall of 2022, Ukrainian military liberated all the northern areas of Ukraine occupied by Russia, and even kicked Russians from an important city in the south, Kherson. That being said, yes, we were pleasantly surprised, that's an understatement, but still, we were pleasantly surprised that Ukrainian military resisted so successfully. Yet, from the start, of course, the question was, okay, can Ukraine win this war on the battlefield? Military professionals said no, or unlikely yes. Assistance to Ukraine, actually military assistance, had started years before that, more or less after 2014, when Russians annexed Crimea. And US military had been training Ukrainian forces and so on and so forth, and later Ukraine started getting modern weaponry, and more modern weaponry arrived on the way. But the question was, so military victory. So can Ukraine win on the battlefield? And the answer was, and there was a consensus. Well, people were not very explicit about that, but the consensus was, no, Ukraine can't win this war on the battlefield. Well, obviously, Russia is a stronger country, its resources are immense, military-industrial complex, cannon, fodder, whatever, you name it, right? So unlikely. Well, okay. So, but the Western alliance gradually, one could say slowly, started providing better modern weapons to Ukraine, and that helped, but we are where we are. After the victories of late summer, early fall of 2022, the front line had been more or less stable. Recently, the commander-in-chief of Ukrainian military forces, General Zaluzhny, said that it's kind of a stalemate. He said, and I personally think he's right, that now Ukrainians and Russians are fighting a positional war, something what we see in World War I movies, right? You know, trenches, people dying here, people dying there. Immense casualties, you know, just to capture, I don't know, 1 square mile of a really insignificant settlement, so on and so forth. So, all right, a stalemate, okay? Can Putin live with this stalemate? He can. He can. I will be talking about Russia's domestic situation a bit later, but a brief answer, yes. Putin and Russian elite seem to be okay with this. So, okay, it's stalemate, okay. So the fighting is ferocious, there are casualties, we can live with that. Can Ukrainians live with that? The answer, well, long term, of course, no. The country is already exhausted, physically, psychologically, and just even in terms of the number of people Ukraine can conscript and send into fighting is limited. And of course, you know, the fatigue is immense. And of course, at least 7 million Ukrainians, at least, have been displaced, right? You know, several million in Eastern Europe. Well, some, you know, make it to North America, but some in western parts of Ukraine. But the country, it's bleeding. So even in terms of its resources, and of course resolve long term, you know, that stalemate can last, well, God knows, you know, how long, but Ukraine's resources are limited. One must say that after the Russian full-scale invasion, Russian invasion of Ukraine started in 2014, right? Crimea and then Eastern Ukraine, the area of Donbass. But full-scale invasion started in February 22. So after that, you know, after that war started, Ukrainian leaders announced that we will win this war on our terms, meaning that will liberate all Ukrainian territories annexed or occupied by Russia. That means including Eastern Ukraine, that has been separate from Ukraine for almost 8 years, and also Crimea. That was unrealistic from the start. That's a sad reality. Though the leaders of the West kept saying, we support Ukrainian war goals because it's the right thing to do, it's fair, well, of course it's fair, because, you know, Russia in 2014 started behaving like no other country in Europe had since Hitler, right? Just walking in and grabbing someone's land. So where Ukraine's goals kind of justified, of course, sure. But Again, we preferred not to dwell too much on that, you know, a year ago, a year and a half ago, but it's time, you know, to start talking about that openly again. You know, I just can't imagine the situation when Russia would evacuate Crimea. Crimea, you know, for many reasons. It's important, it has symbolical value, and also it's extremely difficult to attack and reconquer, right? You know, so I can't see, you know, Russia ever giving up on Crimea, and unless Russian state completely collapses, that could happen. But so, the eastern Ukraine, the areas of Donbass, they have zero kind of, you know, historical or strategic importance for Russians, but if they let Ukraine have them, they lose face. And also, those territories, eastern Ukraine, Donbass, from the start, and a lot of people there supported Russia, even wanted to be part of Russia, or, you know, be kind of part of the Russian sphere of influence. During 8 years of occupation, of course, collaboration, not just collaboration, but new structures, new systems, you know, people, ordinary people, many of them good people, most of them good people, I suppose, right? Still, you know, now working with Russians, and they have built their lives around that. So, liberating those areas, you know, well, so this means what? Ukraine marches in, you know, first trials start. You collaborated with Russians. Oh, he collaborated, you know, even more, and so on and so forth. It's a complete mess. Ukraine does not need that either. You know what? So, actually, I think, you know, yesterday, Zelensky said something like that. He said that, well, you know, eastern Ukraine, well, you know, is it worth it, you know? So he is kind of, you know, backtracking his goals. All right, so, but now, after almost 2 years of ferocious fighting, if Zelensky or any other Ukrainian leader starts saying, you know, seriously, consistently that, okay, let's forget about Ukraine, eastern Ukraine and Crimea, to the people that will sound like defeat. I understand, I understand any Ukrainian leader who is terrified, by those prospects. So, okay. So, what Russia has conquered and been able to keep since then, right? That huge by European standards, but still those huge territories in the south. So, okay, the map. So that's east, that's west, correct? Yes. Right, yeah. So the whole, northern coast of the Sea of Azov, making Azov a Russian lake, and also the territories north of Crimea, right? So for Zelensky, or again, for any other Ukrainian leader to say, we need to liberate at least these, logical, reasonable, and also, what? That means, if Russia is allowed to keep those territories, well, that's a huge win for Russia. Okay, so military, okay. So that's the military issues. A lot, has been done, to sanction Russia, sanction Russians, and many nations, well, first of all, mostly nations of the Western world joined, sanctions against Russia. And a year, well, 2 years, a year and a half ago, we hoped that eventually those sanctions would cripple Russian economy. Yes, we were told by whatever, experts in the field that, okay, this is not going to happen overnight, right? It's economic sanctions. Takes time, months, possibly more than a year. So now, well, I guess, now we can look at the outcome. So Russian economy, bottom line, Russian economy survived. Economy as a whole, it survived. And now for next year, 24, it's projected that Russian GDP will even possibly grow a bit. Even if it does not grow but kind of remains stable, that's already a victory for Putin. How this happened? I mean, why why the sanctions did not prove as devastating as we expected them to be? Well, one problem, one factor. People talked about that from the start. They say, okay, if you disconnect Russia, well, first of all, as a supplier of resources, right? Fossil fuels and everything else. If you disconnect Russia as a supplier of resources from the West, Russia will refocus, will shift to the East, China and India. That's what happened. That was expected. Yes, China and India are buying Russian, let's say, oil, right, at very low prices. But the volume of trade is huge. So all in all, Russia is still making enough money to stay afloat. China has increased its oil imports not significantly by like 13%, 1-3. But in case with India, the increase was more like 50%, and so on and so forth. What makes Russian economy function is resources. And of course, India and China, well, the demand for resources, especially energy, right, is practically, there is no limit to that, for that market. Another thing which not many people thought would happen, what Russians call the so-called parallel import. So Russia was sanctioned, right? Not just high tech, right, but many other products, were put on the sanctions list. You can't export this to Russia, period. But we're living in a very interconnected world. The way global economy works today, it's interesting, right? So how can you, it's unrealistic to believe that you can make every Western company stop selling products to, say, Turkey. Of course, China, but let's say, Turkey, a NATO member, by the way, right? So Turkey buys those products and then re-exports them into Russia. And Turkey is just, it's a very wide gate, right? But the same is happening in Armenia, in Georgia, in Kazakhstan, and so on and so forth. So, that parallel import That's what Russians call it, right? It does not work for them 100%. And as far as we can see, or at least hope, you know, a lot of military-grade high-tech still can't reach Russia. Some of it, yes, you know, it still, you know, sneaks, you know, into Russia through that, you know, parallel import. But a lot of it can't. Okay. Okay. So, and some industries, like aviation industry in Russia, have been hit hard. But looking at the bigger picture, it's still fine. And what's also kind of, well, it's important, the products that used to reach Russian consumer from the West, right? You know, simple, basic things that make up the way of life, right? They keep coming in. Yes, smaller quantities, higher prices often, but all in all, it's there. So the Russian streets, so to say, right? The ordinary people, yes, you know, inflation, prices are higher, but it's not like they have lost access to the wonderful goods of the West. So, okay, I guess I have like 10 more minutes. Okay, great. So, sanctions. Yes, one more thing. Sanctions don't do business with Russia, sure. But when you look at the situation with foreign businesses in Russia, right? Well, leaving Russia is very costly, right? Some of them still did that. Usually we're talking about, you know, bigger companies like BP or whatever, right? But at a huge cost. Russian government is making sure that there is even some kind of an exit tax between 5 and 10%. Then when a foreign company, a foreign business wants to sell its business, it can't sell it, you know, for a bigger sum than larger sum than 50% of the value. And the value is determined, guess by who? By the Russian government, right? You know, so basically, we expected Western businesses kind of, you know, to be moral, or to be on the side of the good guys, sure. But business is business, right? Losses. For some companies, that's not too significant. For some, it's a big deal. So sanctions. Yes, but. So. All right, two more things. You know, one kind of, again, going, you know, talking about our hopes in early 22. So the majority of nations will condemn Russia, we said. Yes, that happened. Sure. Furthermore, two traditionally neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, have joined NATO. Well, Finland has joined NATO. Sweden will join NATO shortly, hopefully. So that's a huge change for Russia in terms of geostrategy, right? And even in terms of condemnation, moral stance, that's big, right? Also, let's say, you know, somehow, you know, by divine miracle, you know, this war ends tomorrow. It won't, but okay. Okay, now guess, for how many decades, you know, to come, Russian citizens will be associated in other countries. First of all, with war, brutality, and aggression, right? It's similar to how, the people of Germany felt for so many years after World War II. And, okay, you know what? People still make, well, possibly tasteless, but still, they make jokes about Germans, right? Their militaristic habits and so on and so forth. That's part of the image of Germany, still, 80 years after World War II. So, can we say that Russia's reputation in the West is ruined? Yes. Oh, it's, I don't know, for 30 years, 50 years, 70 years, yes, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky, whatever, yes, sure. But, well, Germany had Mozart, Beethoven, and, right, same deal. So, yes, Russia became an outcast. Yes, sure, okay. So we kind of achieved what we wanted to achieve. Did that impact, the domestic situation in Russia? I wouldn't. No. Now, last thing, well, yeah. Like again, at the beginning of the war, possibly our biggest hope was regime change in Moscow. Well, Mr. Putin, feels overwhelmed and weak, he steps down, or, okay, someone takes care of Mr. Putin, ha ha ha, right, so a palace coup, right, or people's uprising. Not happening. The palace coup, you do remember that absolutely, I don't know, I'm sorry, but remember that, Prigozhin mutiny last summer, right, the only adjective that comes to mind, is idiotic, right, it was like a farcical charade, a bad, musical, whatever. Let's take Moscow now, drop the idea. So, no palace coup is on the horizon. That's horrible news. Not just because, it would be nice to get rid of Mr. Putin, wouldn't it, right? But this, this is not what we expected from the Russia's, well, top 1%, right? The dominant minority, the ruling class of Russia. We thought that their survival instincts, right? Actually, their lives became worse because they're losing. They've lost many of them lost most of their privileges, right? For them, free access to the outside world. Using, I don't know, Paris, LA, New York, whatever you name it, as a playground was huge, right? Part of their self-esteem. Now their playground is Dubai, okay. And seriously, the expectation was that, okay, they would say, come on, that guy, well, Putin, right, is making our life, well, thoroughly unpleasant. Let's do something about it. No. Okay? So for whatever reason, the dominant minority in Russia, right, they remain, I would say, lethargic, right? Just kind of. So that hope gone. As for the Russian street, protests in Russia, right? Well, I'm not surprised that, we didn't see much of that. We did see something in the first couple of weeks of war. Then, the protests stopped. Russian society, again, remains quiet, passive, kind of, we can't be sure if they support Putin or not, right? There are various polls done in Russia. You can't trust them. And in any case, supporting, a leader is it's a big term. What they did, what it looks like, what the majority of Russians really support is that kind of status quo, right? Not ideal, not good, but okay. Okay, let's keep what we have. God knows what may come if we start changing things. You've most certainly read, about that massive exodus of Russians, right? Younger people, some of them leaving the country just because, they strongly disapproved of the regime, the war. Others left Russia because, they didn't want to be drafted into the army and sent to the front. According to some estimates, possibly about 1 million of young Russians, mostly men, left the country. Some of them, are now in North America, others in Europe. Very many are in Georgia, Turkey, Armenia, and Central Asia, especially Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. So the people who were, who had it in them to kind of, feel strongly about the war and who did not want to be part of that, they left the country. Okay, so that's what we have now. One thing, then a brief conclusion. So one thing, yes, we don't see any signs of serious mass movement in Russia now. One thing I wanted to bring up. Some of you may remember how the Russian Revolution of February 1917 happened. So that was the revolution that dismissed the regime of Tsar Nicholas II, right? Lenin's revolution would come later in the war. So in February 1917, the revolution started as basically as protests of women in Petrograd, the capital of Russia. Bread lines, men at the front, life is bad. So just random riots, protests, they grew into a mass movement. And in a week, the Romanovs dynasty fell. No one had expected that revolution. Not Lenin, no one. So things like that do happen, right? Sometimes, grassroots, can work miracles. So maybe. But that kind of, maybe yes, maybe not, likely, unlikely. But so what are the options now for Ukraine and Russia? All right, so a lot of talk recently about necessity, for some kind of negotiations with Russia. Understandable. Of course, it's up to Ukrainians to decide. We'll see what they come up with. But those negotiations, that's going to be not just hard, it's going to be nightmarish. For Ukrainians, stopping this war, or at least, negotiating a ceasefire, well, it's a necessity. For Russians, despite enormous casualties, right? Putin's regime is okay with this war going on. Furthermore, as many experts have argued, it's unlikely that Mr. Putin would agree to negotiate peace or even permanent ceasefire in Ukraine before U.S. presidential elections in November 24. Well, we don't need to go into the reasons for that. So bottom line. So here are Ukrainians, here are Russians. Russians are sitting like that, right? Ukrainians, okay, what do you want? Okay, what? Forget about Eastern Ukraine, forget about Crimea. So what? Ukrainians say, at least go back to the border of February 23rd, 22. So Russians saying, what? Evacuate those wonderful territories of South Ukraine? What? What? Oh. So one thing, right? So any kind of long-term solution, impossible to imagine. Okay, ceasefire. Ceasefire. Again, for Russians, right? Ceasefire is not a necessity. Ukraine still cannot and won't attack Russia, Russian territory inside the Russian borders. Yes, there are some, drone attacks and so on and so forth, but so to say, mainland Russia is untouched by the war, and so ceasefire. Do we need this? So Russians say to Ukrainians, so what do we get from this ceasefire? Ukrainians don't have anything to give. And then Russians say, okay, we have an idea. How about the West lifts its sanctions? Right? Well, I'm sure there are people in this room that know more about economy and sanctions than I do. But one of the sanctions that kind of seems to be really hurting Russia is that Russia was disconnected from the SWIFT system, right? That banking network. So Russians say, okay, give us something. So how about you, the people of the West, if you care about poor Ukrainians so much, show us some goodwill, right? And lift sanctions. So now, I refuse to think, how, any Western leader, not just President Biden, but, everyone in Europe will feel at the moment, right? So what? And Russians, okay, Russians and, Russian propaganda, whatever, assets in this country and everywhere, they will be saying, look, the Americans and Germans and Europeans, they say they care about Ukrainian lives, right? We give them a way out, all right? And the people of the West are not responding. Hypocrisy, blah, blah, blah. So, well, again, I wish, I could share a more positive perspective, but I can't. Thank you. So if you have questions, please ask for the mic. Thank you.
So obviously, Putin initially wanted everything from what is Ukraine. If things somehow do end at this stalemate, if Russia gets the south of Crimea, do you think that NATO would then accept Ukraine, the rest of Ukraine in NATO, thus forestalling Putin's ability to take it all?
That's a great question, and I did not talk about NATO expansion at all. Okay, my short answer will be no. No. Okay, I'm sorry. Well, okay, this semester I am teaching a class on Russian foreign policy at Amherst College, right? So, and we talk about this a lot. And we had a crisis simulation, a war game, involving NATO, so on and so forth. Okay, so accept, seriously inviting Ukraine to join NATO, the responsibility to protect Ukraine against Russia. I'm sorry, I can't imagine a situation when, let's say, the U.S. Senate approves that. I just concede. And honestly, no matter, who is, the president of the United States or the chancellor of Germany, okay, to risk the well-being of US citizens in a real way for the benefit of a brave, beautiful, but foreign country, I don't know. So.
Russia is expanding the war with drone attacks and missile attacks in Kiev and all that. But Ukrainians are not able to respond to that kind of attacks by going into Russian territory. That is a one-sided war. How can they best accept that? How can NATO accept that?
My heart is with you. And actually, what's left of my brain, right, is kind of with you too. Because, okay, a war in which one party is not allowed to attack the territory of another party, well, what kind of victory can there be? Okay, I'm going to say something, okay, graphic and gross, whatever, but let's say if a major Russian city, Moscow or St. Pete, are being attacked in a serious way by Ukrainians, just, proportionally. Ukrainians doing to Russians what Russians are doing to Ukrainians. And if it's happening in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and yes, well, I'm sorry, including the residential areas, that's what Russians attack in Ukraine, that would have definitely changed the public opinion in Russia. So I'm with you on that. And that we could be talking about, people's protesting, maybe finally, even the oligarchs coming together. Okay, so all good, but how will Russia respond? Putin's Russia. Several times, Putin and of course others, they said that, if you attack Russia, then nothing is off the table. We heard about that a lot, Russia using technical nukes in Ukraine, right? There is another scenario, maybe more realistic than, technical nuke on the ground. Okay, let's, well, people have been writing about that. What Russians may do, they may, explode and nuclear device basically, well, almost at the border of outer space, at a huge altitude. So no shock wave, no heat wave, and no radiation reaches the ground. So it's not like people are being killed by a nuclear blast by Russians. But the electromagnetic pulse resulting from that explosion, it reaches the ground like that, and this whole, it kills everything electrical and electronical. So basically that huge territory on the ground becomes silent and dark. And of course people are dying in hospitals and so on and so forth. So is that a nuclear attack? Yes, but yes. So, okay, I'm sorry, but I think that Putin's regime is quite capable of that. Okay, I'm sorry, but okay, if, God forbid, they do that, responding to Ukrainian attack on Moscow or whatever, right? So they do that. What does the West say? Thoughts and prayers? One thing. Of course, humanitarian mission to the affected areas of Ukraine, possibly, some huge, financial aid to so on and so forth. and are you going to, well, right? So that's there was a long answer to your question. So it makes perfect sense, but what comes after that?
Basically, it is a nuclear blackmail.
Yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. Oh yes. Of course, absolutely. And so yeah, yeah, and it works. It works. You.
You opened by saying, what? You opened by saying, I have bad news. Putin is not dead. But what if something did happen to Putin? What follows? Do we know the devil we have, or what?
Uh, uh, so if Putin dies, right? If finally, you know, I don't know, devil, you know, gets tired and say, okay, enough with you. Okay, so what's next? There have been many analytical articles written about that, and many authors say that, well, things could get even worse than with Putin. And there are names of people in Putin's entourage. I would not bother you with them, but some of those people, well, potentially they could be even more ruthless than Putin. Fanatical imperialists, right, you know, could be. One can only hope that, you know, that when something happens to, you know, okay. How do we know if something happens to Putin or not? The guy has at least 4 doubles. You know? So, right? No, I know, you know, I try and be funny and I'm not, right? So, if, you know, when Putin eventually, you know, dies, I think the best we could hope is another perestroika. You do remember the term from the 80s, Gorbachev, right? So reforms serious enough to significantly change the system. But again, perestroika is very much on the minds of Russian elites. Every time you know, someone sees, you know, reforms after Putin, they say, okay, we lost the Soviet Union after perestroika 1, right? So what are we going to lose after perestroika 2? So, but I think, you know, that's the best case scenario still. Some period of, okay, you know, perestroika possibly is a wrong word to use, thaw, right? You know, it's again, you know, a historical term for Russia, Khrushchev's thaw, right? So after Stalin's death. So not really, you know, restructuring stuff, but okay, you know, kind of, you know, unfreeze, you know, people unfreeze the country. So, and, well, and I think, you know, for now that would be good enough.
Thank you. I'm learning a lot, not all what I want to hear, but I appreciate it. 2 questions, if I might. Is there any validity to the rumors about Putin's health? And, go ahead. And what was the rationale for Zelensky's announcing months in advance that he was going to do a major push? I don't understand that at all, and so thank you.
Thank you for your questions, and sadly, you know, I can't answer them. So Putin's health, well, yes, you know, there are signs, and our medical professionals have been trying to interpret those signs, this and that, you know, the way he walks, the way he, whatever, and okay, He turned 70 last October, right? And well, as most of us unfortunately know, after a certain age, you start kind of, yeah. So in case with Putin, there are grounds for optimism, right? But there were several times that, there were rumors saying he is dying, right? But of course, that could happen. The second question, you said you don't understand why Zelensky publicized his counteroffensive. You called it his push so much. I think that was a terrible mistake. Because, Ukrainians, well, Zelensky and others, they started talking about that major offensive, I think last May or whatever, right? Or whatever, June, saying, okay, we'll show Russians. How, doesn't make any sense to me because, of course, you don't advertise your, I don't know. And one quick, whatever, side note. The Russians they're fighting now, Ukrainians, are different from the Russians they fought like 2 years ago. Unfortunately, Russian military commanders have learned a lot. They have learned a lot. That's the opinion of Western analysts of Ukrainian military. So Russians were still, well, unprepared, not modern, disorganized a year ago. That's why Ukraine was successful in pushing them north, away from Kiev and Kharkov, and in the south from Kherson. Now Russians have learned their lessons. They're on defensive, and the defensive lines are very strong. So going back to your question, I don't understand, and I think it was a very big mistake. But okay, who are we to criticize Zelensky, right? The guy who is surviving under the.
Thank you so much. We have a little present for you. Assignment China by Mike Chinoy, one of our previous speakers.
Thank you so
Hope
much.
You'll enjoy it.
Thank
I
you.
especially wanted to thank Constantine Pleshakov. He referenced speaking to us right after the invasion, and so we're a small organization, so we get excited about some little things. It was the first time we had the same turnout in a virtual event that we'd had pre-pandemic, which was just very exciting. And then Jeremy Cole shared it on social media, including Reddit, where he got over
Telegram, right?
over 10,000 responses.
250,000 actually.
Right, 250,000. We don't get anything that gets 250,000 responses. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank you personally, because one of the things that motivates me is I really want to I want us to be a good neighbor. And I got an email just before the anniversary from Paul Tuttle from WAMC, and he said, this is my dream question. Who do you have who can talk on whatever? And in this case, it was, who do you have that can talk about Russia and Ukraine? And I knew immediately who to recommend, and he said yes to Paul Tuttle, and Paul Tuttle interviewed him. So I'm very grateful
Thank you
for that, because that's
Thank you for that.
that's like one of
Thank
my
you.
highest.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming. We don't have anything scheduled. I've been a little busy. Chemo is done. Surgery is tomorrow. I'm hoping that we'll be scheduling something in the new year, but we're gonna see how things go. Thank everybody for the support. I have people like Jamie Kelly texting me on a regular basis, making sure I'm hydrating. So thank you all, and I hope you have a good holiday season.
Thank you so much.